Hello and welcome to Jerry's Live. My name is Michaela and I'm going to be your host tonight. Now, tonight is going to be another one of my favorites. We are going to be talking about printmaking tonight. And specifically, we're going to be talking about drypoint etching. Now, the best part about this process is you can do this at home. I know if you have tried printmaking maybe in a college setting or in a studio, they have these huge big press beds and a whole setup that requires very specific like chemicals and tools. These things that we have for tonight is everything that you can have at home, so you don't really have to worry about all of those extra stuff. So this is going to be really nice to have an at-home print shop. Now, before we jump in, I want to make sure you guys know today's class code is going to be JL368. And if you pop that code on our website, JerrysArtarama.com, in the search bar, it will pull up everything that I'm using tonight in case you want to do this on your own. Now, because Valentine's Day is coming up this Friday, today's theme is going to be about making multiples. So making multiple Valentine cards to send out to people or give as gifts. But since there's quite a lot to go through today, let's just go ahead and jump straight in. Now, I always like to start safety first. I'm going to put on some gloves. The biggest thing that I'm going to be using gloves for is for the ink. That's later on. But I just like to have them on straight off the bat so I don't have to worry about them later. Now, you need a few things before you jump straight into printing your final piece. Now, I have two different surfaces, and I'm going to show you how to prep and create art on both of them, as well as some tools to use for these as well. Now, for drypoint etching, traditional etching prints are done on copper plates. I have two different kinds of plates. I have a zinc plate, which is going to be the most similar to copper. And then I have a acrylic tile or plexiglass. Both of these are great options for drypoint etching. Now I'm going to be using mostly the acrylic tile because it is going to be my favorite out of these two, but they both have their own advantages and disadvantages. So I'll talk about those right now. Now, when you are creating art on a drypoint plate, first, you want to start with a sketch. So, I have my sketch here, and I wanted to do something kind of Valentine's themed. If we go to the overhead, you can probably see that a little bit better. I wanted to do a little raccoon floating from these little heart balloons, like he got kind of tangled and is now like floating off with these little heart balloons. Now, once you have your sketch, you're going to want to transfer your sketch onto your plate. And depending on which plate you're using, you're going to want to use a different process. Now let's start with the zinc plate. Let's say you want to use the zinc plate. Transferring this image onto here, you're going to want to print your sketch off from a laser printer. You're going to wipe this down with some acetone. You will take your laser printed image, let's say this is a laser printed image, place it laser side down, so wherever side it was printed on, place that straight down onto your thing, and I would cut it out the same size as your plate so you can line it up perfectly. And then you'll take more acetone, make sure the image doesn't move once you start doing this, and you're going to soak the paper with acetone. That's going to allow that laser printed image to transfer straight onto this zinc plate, and you'll be able to see it lightly. Another option, if you don't need to transfer an exact image onto your plate, is I have these Sharpie Pro China markers, and you can draw directly onto your plate using these China markers, and it will look white. You'll be able to see where your sketch is, and you can plan it out that way as well. I know it's kind of shiny. I hope you guys can kind of see what I'm doing there. Now, a great advantage if you are using one of these clear acrylic tiles is if you are trying to transfer your image onto one of these, if you draw your sketch the same size as your plate, this is clear. So I can just line this up with my sketch, and I can see my sketch through this plate, and I can go directly onto that plate, and then I can use something else to see the scratch marks. Now I'm going to show you how difficult it is to see once you start drawing on this, but before we do any of that, we have to prep these plates. Now, when you have these plates, it is really thin, but it's thick enough that once it starts going through the press bed, this edge is going to bump up against that roller. So you want to bevel these edges so they go down at a 45-degree angle so that it can pass through underneath this roller. So I'm going to do that first with this guy that I already have clamped down to a table. We have a question?
Yes, you were saying that you had a laser print, like laser printer print. Could it be an inkjet print?
No. So you want the laser printer because that's going to allow, once you have that acetone, it's going to allow that ink to like remove from the paper and then adhere to the plate. I mean, it potentially could work with a different type of printer, but I've never tried it that way. I'm assuming laser printer is going to be the only way for that to work. Now, let's go ahead and go to the dynamic. In order to bevel your edges, you're going to want to take a C-clamp, and I have a couple little mat board chips that I cut down to like 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches square. You'll want to have it on both sides, ideally, but just to show you guys, I just have this one side so you can see what I'm doing. I put down 2 little pieces of mat board, which I got a huge mat board sheet, which I think is like 32 by 40. It's huge. And I cut it down into these little squares, and I'm going to use these for multiple different things during this print process. This is going to be one of them. Now the reason I have these on here is because I don't want this clamp making direct contact with my plate, because every little scratch and ding that I have on this surface is going to potentially print. So this is here to act as a cushion to protect my plate before I jump in and add my art. Now to create the bevel, I have this metal file here, and there are 2 different sides. Most of these files are going to have 2 different sides. This side is going to be kind of a thinner grain, and this is going to be a thicker grain. Now, since this acrylic or plexi is really soft, I don't need to start with one and then switch to the other. If I was beveling my edges on the zinc plate, I would start with the thicker grain and then transfer to the thinner one. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the angle of my file is at 45 degrees, and I don't want to go back and forth, and I don't want to start on one side and then do the other side. You want to do one clean motion across the entire edge of your plate here. So I'm going to hold it at 45 degrees, and then I'm going to slowly pull it down as I go all the way across the plate here. So one solid swipe, making sure I'm staying at 45 degrees. And you're going to want to do this until that bevel is noticeable, especially from the side. Now I'm not going to do it completely to where I want it to be because that's going to take a little bit of time. But I did want to show you that once you start doing this, you might get these little fuzzies hanging off the edge here. And in order to kind of cut those off, I'm going to have this perpendicular to the edge of my plate here. And just kind of lightly saw those off, and then you should be a-okay. I'm just going to make sure that the amount of this bevel that's coming into the plate is the same all the way across. So let's say I think it's a little bit thinner right here. I'm just going to even it out, and then I should be all good. I did bevel all the other sides, so this is now ready to go. We have another question?
Yes, about the beveling. Would you ever switch and swipe the other direction?
You could. Now the reason I'm doing it all in one direction is to make sure I don't have any what we call burrs end up in your beveled area. Now I'm going to take this apart now and show you guys how to start adding your line work and your art. But once you start making your work, you want to create these burrs. So what happens when you scratch into, sorry, I'm trying to switch this clamp over to my press bed. Once you start digging into the surface of your plate, what happens is when your tool, like here's one of my tools here, my etching needles, once you press into the plate, the tool is going to go down and push everything around it up and out. So it's going to create kind of like a ravine. And those pieces that kind of come out, those are going to be called a burr. And that's going to be causing texture, and that's what the ink, once we start inking this up, that's what the ink is going to stick to. Now if we go back and forth on the edges for our bevel, you could potentially end up creating a little bit of texture that the ink will stick to. And ideally you don't want that. You could do it in a way where that's purposeful and create a really nice border, but just being aware of that. Now let's go ahead and do our little raccoon. I'm gonna move these chips out of the way. And once you start making marks in this acrylic, you can really use just about anything that's going to make a mark. So this is going to be a traditional etching needle. It's going to be like a really fine steel point that will dig into that surface. I also have an Excel swivel blade. Once you start working into the plate, it's going to be, I don't want to say hard, but it's not going to be as smooth as if you were working with like pencil on paper. This is going to kind of drag at the surface, so it's kind of hard to create curves and really nice rounded edges with your etching needle. I found that with the swivel blade, since this is so soft, I can create really nice curves and circles with this guy. You can also use sandpaper. I have this zinc plate that I used over here that I had used sandpaper to create kind of like a gray tone. And you can also use like a Dremel tool. And I have an example of that down here as well. I did this big guy a while ago. This is also acrylic. And these marks down here in the sweater, that was done with a Dremel. And it's just going to tear up at that surface, allowing really nice thick areas of line work to your image. You have another question?
So we wanted to confirm, do you need to bevel if you're using the metal one?
You do, yep.
And
Any
then,
plate.
Okay. And then also, which side goes up?
With the acrylic, either side, both sides are going to have like a protective layer. The zinc plate, you could potentially use both sides. However, the way that this side comes unprotected, and this side comes protected, and I'll show you guys. This side is going to be a lot smoother. This would be the side I would want to use because it's going to be cleaner, it's going to be protected, and it's going to be a lot more shiny and smooth, easy to wipe than this side will be.
Also, like, more like, does it matter which side the bevel?
Oh, yes. Okay. So the bevel is going to be, let's say this is the image side. The bevel is going to be on this side. So it's going to be starting here, going down to the bottom side, if that makes sense. Okay. And I'm going to do this cooking show style because this does take quite a bit of time, but I do want to show you guys what it looks like once you start etching into these plates. So I'm going to go in and start pulling. You can see how much of a resistance I have once I start pulling these lines, and you'll hear how it sounds once you start scraping into it. I hope it's not an awful noise. But when it comes to dry point etching, the biggest thing is you are creating your image using line work. You can't really create like large blocks of color. Now, in order to do that, you can use cross hatching, which is what I did for the final image of this. But once I get a little bit of this balloon in here, we'll go to that dynamic and show you guys what I am seeing. Because another fun thing is it's hard to see what you're doing, but I like to start getting my main sketch down, like get my whole outline sketched, and then take something dark, like I have this black piece of construction paper, and now I can see those lines that I've created. Are we able to see that in the dynamic?
It's on the... I have to pull it up.
Okay. So you can see my line work is starting to show through. It's a lot easier to see on something dark because once you start scratching it in, it's going to look white. So it's going to be a little tricky to see as you work. So finding that right angle where like the light hits it, you'll be able to see what you're doing. Now, another thing that you're going to want to do before you start printing is you're going to want to prep some paper. Now, I have Mangiani printmaking paper today. I have one more tool I want to show you guys, so I'll jump back to this. But for the paper, you're going to want to make sure you cut down all your papers to the size that you want, because once you start inking up your plate and getting ready to print, you want your paper to be soaking in water. So I want to show you guys, let's move this out of the way real quick. I want to show you guys how to cut down your paper if you like the deckled edge. Now, I am a sucker for a deckled edge, which is this torn-like edge. And these sheets originally come in 22 by 30, and I cut them down to the size that I need, but I really love the way they come with that deckled. So I'm going to show you how I tear these down to the right size and keep that deckled edge. Now, this is a new product. This is going to be the Accurate Detachable T-Square, and I use this for tearing down all of my sheets of paper. And it's really nice. The ruler part comes in one pocket, and then there's another little pocket in here that holds the T-square. So let's go ahead and take this out. And to put this together, I just take this side and slide it in on top, and now I have a T-square. And I cut down all of my papers the same way, where I take a sheet of paper and I line up the top of my T-square with the top of my paper. And then I take a pencil, I got a jumbo jet, and I mark where I want my line to go, very lightly. And once I start doing this, I'm making sure I'm using the back of my paper. You can decide what that is. I believe Magnani has a little bit of different texture on both sides. On one side, it's kind of like a spotted, like really uniform texture, and then on the other side, it's slightly different where it's a little bit longer in those speckled areas. But decide which side you want the front to be. You're going to mark and tear from the back. So this is going to be the back of my paper, so I can mark the back. And then I'm going to take the T-square off my ruler. I'm going to line up my ruler with that mark I made. Hold this down really well. You do not want this to move. And ideally, you want the ruler to be on the side of the line where you want the paper to be, if that makes sense. So this is the part that I want to keep. This is the part I do not want to keep. I want the ruler to be on the side that I want to keep. So in case you accidentally tear like an ugly edge, you want it so that this side is protected by the flatness of your ruler. So I'm going to hold this down really well. And I'm just going to start tearing that paper towards the ruler. And you can pick off anything that didn't quite go to plan. And then you have your nice rectangular sheet of paper. This would then be the front of the paper. I can add that to my stack. Now there was one more tool I wanted to show you guys when it comes to creating marks. And usually people will get to this tool once they print their first proof. Now what that means is when it comes to printmaking, the first print that you make isn't necessarily going to be considered a final image. It could, but it's typically going to be considered a proof. So you're basically printing it to see what it looks like, because there's no way to know what your print is going to look like until you print it. And then you will adjust your plate once you know what your print is looking like. Now this is the tool that we usually bring out after that step. This is going to be a burnishing tool. And I have quite a few different nibs for this that you can replace up here. Right now I have like a little ball. It's just going to be, I believe, a steel ball. And I can go in, for example, on this one. I use sandpaper up here, and I completely got rid of my little fox piece. There we go. I completely got rid of my fox. I covered it up with sandpaper. Now, once I have that sandpaper and that texture, that is going to print like a gray. I want this to be white. Oh no, how do I reverse that? That's what the burnishing tool is for. So you can kind of see I already went in here, it's shiny inside the fox. The burnishing tool is basically going to remove your texture. So remember when I said that you press down and it creates kind of like a groove and it creates these burrs? In order to remove that texture and therefore the burr and where the color is going to go, you want to flatten that back down and fill in that little crevice. So this is what the burnisher is for. You can go in, press down that texture, and get back to a white. It's a little bit harder to do with the acrylic than it is with a zinc or copper plate, but this is still an excellent tool to have, especially with Drypoint. All right. Now, that was prepping your plate and your paper. The next step is you have your finished plate. Now it is black right now because I've already printed this, so there's still ink kind of stuck in those grooves. But once you are done and you haven't printed it yet, it's going to look white. Now another really important thing to know when it comes to printmaking in general is your image is going to be reversed. So this is the side that I scratched on, but it's really nice with the acrylic tile. I can just flip it over and now I know what my image is going to look like. Because I'm going to ink up this side, flip it over onto the paper is going to be on the side, and it's going to transfer that way, and this is going to be the right side up image. So always remember to flip your image when it comes to printmaking. Now let's go ahead and print a plate. Now printing is a very messy process, so I have quite a few things for you guys when it comes to this part of the process. Let me move a couple of things out of the way. And while we are doing this part, I have 4 different colors for paper and only 1 color for ink. So I want you guys to help me figure out what color paper I want to use for the print. I'll show you guys the paper while I set this up. So I have a nice off-white. I have a cream. I have gray, and I have blue. So I'm going to start setting up my station here. These are the 4 colors. I want you guys to vote which color we should be printing our raccoon on. And when it comes to the ink, I have quinacridone magenta. I'm using the Aqua Italio ink, and I have little swatch cards. I always like to see what the color looks like on my paper. So this is the magenta on all 4 of those colors. That's what they look like. I have done the cream already, but I haven't done any of these other colors. So go ahead, take your vote. I'm going to start setting up my area. Now I have some newsprint. Newsprint is going to be your BFF when it comes to printmaking, and that is because this is going to be really nice cheap paper. I use this to kind of make things a little less messy. So I'm just going to tear out a sheet and use this as my workstation. I'm also going to tear out just one more to show you another use for the newsprint. Now remember those mat board chips that I made? I made 2 different kinds. So I have the squares that are like 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. And then I also have these, which are more like a rectangle. And I folded them in half. And these are so fun because once you start inking up your plate, your hands are dirty. You don't want to keep removing your gloves and everything. In order to keep your paper clean, I have these guys to help you grab onto your piece of paper so you don't get any like little fingerprints on your paper.
They're like oven mitts.
Yeah.
My brain just went private loss.
Yeah. Okay, so you're gonna want your plate. You're gonna want these little mat board chips. You have your ink, and then you have your newsprint. Let me scooch this over just a little bit. Now, when it comes to Drypoint etching or intaglio, you really don't need a lot of ink. You need a very little amount of ink. Even when you think you have a little bit, you probably have too much. So let me show you what I mean. And I'm using Aqua ink. This is going to be water-based, but it's also soy-based. So it's a little confusing. This is going to not dry. It dries through, what is the word I'm thinking of?
Absorption.
Absorption, thank you. So it's going to dry through absorbing into the paper. Now that means as long as it's on the plate, it's not going to dry, which is fantastic because you can take a while and it acts like an oil-based ink. But since it is also water-based, you can clean it with soap and water. So super cool for at home. Anyway, so I have these mat board chips. I'm just going to scoop out a little bit from my ink. And another fun thing about this, since it dries through absorption in the paper, it's not going to dry in the can. And if you have done printmaking before, there's going to create like a skin on the top, and every time you open up your oil-based ink, you have to peel that skin off, grab the ink underneath. I like to keep the skin on so I don't have to keep removing new skins. But that's great with the Akua, is you never have those skins drying on the top of your ink. So I'm just grabbing a little dollop of the ink, and I'm going to start wiping this onto the surface using my mat board chip. And if you have like a metal scraper, do not use that on your plate. So I know sometimes if you're mixing your ink into a different color, you can use a metal scraper to mix your inks. Don't use that on the plate because, again, anything can create a scratch, and that scratch is going to print. So I'm just pressing this ink into all of those little crevices and those little burrs I've created. I'm making sure I cover the entire plate. Another fun thing about this ink is it is super easy to wipe off. And it's also then easy to over wipe your image. You can see now that I've added all that ink, I still have like a big glob on here that I didn't use. So very little ink for this process. This little guy will last you a while. I'm actually going to put that back in there so I can save it. Toss this mat board chip. And if I want, I can go back in with another mat board chip to make sure I get rid of any excess ink off the surface. Toss that. Now, once you are at this point, you're going to start wiping the surface. And for that, I have another Akua product, this wiping fabric. It's going to be like a starch tarlatan, but it's going to be a lot softer than traditional tarlatan. So if you are used to printmaking and you haven't tried this, and you're used to that stiff tarlatan, this is going to be a lot softer and a lot more fun to use. You have another question?
Yes. If you want to do a print on a plate later, should you clean the plate right away, or should you just leave the ink with like the traces of ink on there and just deal with it later?
How much later? Like later in the day or like a different day?
How about both?
Okay. Later in the day, since this dries through absorption, it's not going to dry on the plate, so you can keep it there for a couple hours if you wanted to. If it's the next day, I would clean it off with soap and water and then re-ink it the next time you come back. Now for wiping, you're going to take this sheet of tarlatan, I have two of them here, sorry, and you're going to roll it into a ball, but you want to do it a specific way so that the bottom is flat. So what I like to do is I like to kind of tuck everything into the center so that this is flat and this is kind of like jumbled. You don't want this touching your plate. You want the flat side to touch your plate. So I'm kind of tucking it all into the center like this so that this is flat. And then you're going to take that flat side and you're going to press down and twist. And you can easily over wipe your image with this ink, so be very gentle. Don't try and take it all off at once. I'm barely pressing down on this. Now as you do this, you can start to see what they call a plate tone. And that's going to be where you haven't had any marks. That's going to be the plate tone, is whatever color is there. It's really nice to see when you're doing something like this on the newsprint. You'll see your plate tone as you work. And you don't want to touch the surface once you start wiping. Now, once I've gone in with the tarlatan, if I had a different ink, like an oil-based ink, I would continue to undo this and then retuck to a clean area and then keep going. But since this is really easy to wipe, I'm not going to do another little wiping area with the tarlatan. But another use for the newsprint is I take one of these guys, just a little tiny little square of the newsprint, and I'm just going to place it on here and start wiping it off a little bit more. So I want to lighten that plate tone a little bit and get rid of any of those little spirals I created with the tarlatan. And you can, like if it's moving around as you wipe, take another little square from your newsprint and use that to hold your plate still. Because again, you don't want to touch the surface of your plate and potentially ruin or take off too much ink. Another lovely thing about Drypoint is your lines get kind of fuzzy because of that burr. It's not connecting to a very specific line of texture. It's kind of sticking underneath those burrs. So your line work is going to be really nice and soft and fuzzy. The more you use this near your lines, the less fuzzy it's going to be. So if you want something a little bit more crispy, you can really clean up your line work using this. And this does take a bit of time, but I think this will be okay. Now once you do that, I'm now going to take a cotton rag. I like to wrap it around my finger, and I'm going to pick up my plate because there was going to be ink kind of sticking to my bevels and my edges. I want to make sure that I don't get a thick like gloopy line on the edge of my plate. So I'm just going to go in with a cotton rag and wipe off my edges and my bevels. So I get a nice crispy edge. And something I should have done before I started inking this up, now that I'm thinking about it, is before you ink, you want to soak your paper in water for a while. So let me do that real quick. I'm going to use my little grabbers. Do we have a color winner? Blue?
Blue.
It's pretty overwhelming.
Okay, good, because that is the color I also wanted. You guys chose correctly. So I'm going to put my blue sheets of paper. I have a butcher tray filled with water. There's not a lot, it's just like maybe ½ inch of water, just enough for my papers to soak completely.
Is it any kind of like special water?
Nope,
Just tap water.
just tap water. And the reason we soak our papers is because we want that paper to be flexible. It's also going to help that ink adhere to your surface. Now let me make sure my edges are still clean. You might also end up getting ink on the underside of your plate, so I just like to make sure that it's nice and clean before I do my printing. Alright. Now we're going to move over to the printing press. I'm going to push it over a little bit. There is going to be two different sides to the press. Now right now I have the flat side, so there's no extra piece of metal on the edges here. It's just flat all the way across. The great thing about this press is the other side has little pieces of metal on each side so that you can print with a linoleum block. It's going to create a little bit of a resting area for the ruler so that you can have a thicker plate to print on. So you can do 2 different printing processes on this plate or on this printing press, which is really cool. So I have it on the etching side where it's flat all the way across. And it comes with a blanket. This is going to add a little bit of cushion once you start adding pressure. And then I have a registration sheet here. You have another question?
Yes. Paul is wondering if there's an advantage, like why cotton rag is preferable for cleaning up the edges instead of the
The tarlatan?
or newsprint.
So the cotton rag is going to pick up a lot more ink than the other ones. The reason we have the tarlatan and the newsprint is it doesn't pick up all of the ink on the surface. It picks up just a little bit at a time. The cotton rag is just going to grab all that ink because we don't want anything on those edges. Another question?
We have a couple.
Yeah.
About soaking your paper.
Okay.
How long should you soak your paper before printing? And with
Okay.
that, there's like a caveat, secondary question of you can't just dip it, sponge off the excess. It has to sit in the water, right?
You could dip it. However, it's not going to get to the inside of the paper as well. I like to let it soak for at least 5 minutes. You can let it soak for the entirety of your inking process, and that will be perfect. But we want it to soak for a while so that the water is able to get into the center where that sizing might be. Now, it is always going to be cotton paper so that it doesn't fall apart in water. That's why I'm using specifically a printmaking paper. It's going to hold up to that water soaking. All right, now I have this registration sheet on the press bed here. And I just took a piece of paper. I took my plate before I inked it up, traced the outline of my plate, and then I took the sheets of paper that I tore down and I outlined the edge of my paper so that I know exactly where I want my plate to end up inside of my paper. I can line things up perfectly. I don't have to kind of cut things back down to the shape I want. And then I labeled it because I had 2 different plates for the same size paper. And I also labeled my registration sheet so I know which plate or print I used for this registration. And since I have this on here, I have test on here because I also had a test little plate here so I can test different mark making. Which I have the print of it somewhere, maybe. But I wanted to show you this test print because, okay, this is the side that I scratched on. And let me put it against something so you can see, maybe something white. Here we go. You know how I said that everything is flip-flopped? You have to do like the opposite image so that when you flip it over to print, it prints right side up. Same thing goes for lettering. If you have words, you're going to want to make sure that you write it backwards. Let me see. So you can see that Excel blade here is written backwards. And again, the great part of the, there we go. It's written backwards. The great part about this being clear is I can just flip it over to see if I spelled everything correctly and letters are facing the same way. It looks a little funny, but at least all the letters are facing the proper way. But always remember to flip your image when it comes to printmaking. And then with that registration sheet, in order to continue using it and not get it covered in ink and then it ruins your paper, I have it protected with some acetate or Duralar. It's just going to be a nice clear plastic so that I can just wipe it off with a Soho wipe or soapy water, and then jump straight into the next print. But let's go ahead and place our plate into our square. Again, you don't want to touch the top of your plate, so I just line up one edge and then drop it. It's never going to land perfectly, so I just grab one of my tools and push it into place. There we go. And now I'm going to take my paper out of the water. I want to blot it dry.
What keeps it from buckling?
The way that you dry it, and I will show you guys that in a second. So for blotting, I'm just using 2 pieces of paper towel. You can use towels, like real towels if you want, just anything that's clean and can soak up that water. So I'm going to take one of my sheets of paper, let the water drip off, and then I'll place it on my paper towel here, sandwich it. And you want it to be to the point where it's not shiny anymore. You don't want it to be too wet. So I'm just soaking up any of that extra water. Grabbing my little grabbers, making sure I use the front side, because remember we tore and marked on one side. I can see my marks on this side, so I'm going to make sure that this side is the side that touches my plate. So I'm going to line up, I like to line up the top of my registration sheet. Hold it in place, and then drop it. It's always nice to have an extra sheet of newsprint just to protect your felt pad. So I'm just going to tuck that under there. Make sure I don't move my paper. Lay that down. Then I'll put my felt down. And then I'll start rolling it through. Now before today, I did already calibrate this to fit the level of the acrylic plate. Now what I mean is these guys right up here can raise and lower the roller here. Now, if you are adjusting this, you want to make sure that you are turning these the same way at the same time. Now, if you accidentally don't do that right off the bat, another way to measure that the roller is even is counting the threads on the side. I know that's kind of crazy, but you want to make sure that this is level. I already kind of adjusted it and found the right height for this plate. It does take some kind of time to adjust to the right pressure for your plate. And since it is a little loose and then this is a little bit tall, I do kind of have to give it a little bit of a push as I roll it. So I'm pushing and cranking at the exact same time, kind of helping it along. Come on now. There we go. And once it starts going through, you should be all set. I like to push it through just a little bit more past the, there we go, past the edge of my plate. I pull this felt out of the way. I know you guys can't see it for a second. Hold on. Grab my grabbers. I'm just lifting up that newsprint so I can get to my paper again. Use my grabbers to pull it off. And there's my print. It looks so good on the blue. Great choice, you guys. All right, and now every time that you want to print, you're going to do that same process again and again. You're going to take your plate off of here. I want to make sure I wipe down that acetate because I don't want any extra ink to get on my new clean sheet of paper. So I'm wiping this down. And I like to start from the same side every time, so I'm just going to put this all back, roll it back through. There we go. So I can load it back up on this side again. But yeah, look how great we look. Now, when I said that in order to stop it from warping, it's the way that you dry it. Now, the way I'm going to dry these, now you don't have to do this right off the bat. If you want to put this straight on a drying rack, let it dry overnight. It might curl a little bit. You can do this later as well. Ideally, you want to do it straight out of the press. You'll take a sheet of newsprint, sandwich it, and then stack something heavy on it and let it dry that way. Now, if you don't do that, you can let it dry on its own. You can spritz the back with some water, do the same thing, put newsprint on it, put something heavy on it. You can do it after it dries as well if you want. All right, now there is one more thing I wanted to show you guys that is very traditional when it comes to making prints. It is going to be the way that you sign your prints. Now, traditionally, when it comes to signing a print, you are going to sign directly onto the paper in pencil. Which, I don't know if I actually left a pencil up here, but I do have that Jumbo Jet. Let me take off my gloves. Do we have a pencil? Now, when it comes to prints, the biggest thing is you can make multiples. So when you make multiples, you want to create what they call an addition. And what that means is you're making multiples of the same thing. So you're going to make, let's say, I did 10 of these where it's on blue paper with that magenta ink. I'm going to make them all look the same as possible. That's going to be my addition of 10. Now for that, I'm going to use the bottom left hand right underneath my print here. I'm going to say this is my first of my addition of 10. So I'll do 1 over 10. Now there's also an option where, let's say this is just like a test, or you just wanted to see what it would look like with this combination. This isn't going to be part of an addition. That would then be considered an artist proof. So I actually have, I did this print on the white. This is what I considered an artist proof. It's not part of an addition. It's just the single, this is the only one that looks like this. So this is an artist proof. And to kind of indicate that, I have right here, I just put AP for artist proof. So those are your two options when it comes to the bottom left, is it's either an addition, so you do whatever number this is out of however many you did, or AP for artist proof. We have a question?
Yes. Do you have a specific hardness of pencil that you should use as a signing tool?
That's up to you. I don't know why it's traditionally done in pencil, but if you have like a really light soft print, maybe use a really light soft graphite. Or if you have a really dark graphic image that's dark and black, you can use a really dark graphite. It's totally up to you. But okay, so there's three things when it comes to the signature. There's the bottom left where it's either an addition or an artist proof. In the middle, you're going to want to put the title of your piece. So I think I guys show you guys. I called this one Stolen Hearts. So I'm just going to write Stolen Hearts in the middle. And then on the bottom right, that is going to be where you put your signature. So I'll just put my signature down here. And then you can see that is how you sign your traditional print at the very bottom. You have that edition on the left, title in the middle, signature on the right. Did we have another question?
Yes. Instead of using a printing press, could you have used a burnisher?
You could. I would use one that's not felt, and I think it's a Baron.
That might be good one.
Yes, so you can use a Baron. It's going to take a lot longer. It's going to take a hard Baron, so you don't want one that's made of felt. You want something harder, like maybe even a wooden spoon if you're doing that. Printing press is going to be a lot faster. It's going to be definitely worth the money. Even if you get like 10 prints out of this guy, it's going to be worth it, I promise.
And then you said, how often do you have to re-ink? Is it between every print?
Between every print. And another thing when it comes to dry point etching, especially if you're using the acrylic tile, over time, the more you roll it through the press, the more those burrs are going to flatten. So you only get a certain number of prints out of each plate. The zinc plate is going to last a lot longer than the acrylic. But the more you print a dry point, the softer and like less punchy it's gonna get. Another question?
Yes. Would you ever sign it with a date?
You could. If you didn't have a title for it, you could just put the date in the middle. This is just the traditional way to sign a print. You don't have to do it that way. If you are submitting this to a printing contest, that's going to be how they traditionally know that it should be signed. But if you're doing it for yourself or for a friend, and it's not for a like specific printmaking thing, you don't have to sign it this way. Any other questions?
Is an artist proof worth more than like one of the series prints? Would you say?
An edition would be worth more. Artist proof are more unique because there's usually only one, but usually artist proofs aren't given out to the public, if that makes sense. Another question?
Within an edition, is it always the same colored ink, or can you change the ink? And if you change the ink, is that considered a new edition?
You could. I've seen it happen because I've had print exchanges that I've been a part of where everyone got a different colored print. But it's nicer to have an edition that looks exactly the same the entire way through. If you have a different color, I would just start a new edition. That way, because usually when they see a little fraction in the bottom left, they're going to assume that there's 10 others that look exactly like this one. So I would usually follow that. You don't have to. I know there's rules in art, but the rules are meant to be broken. So it's up to you, but traditionally, an edition is going to look exactly the same all the way through. Any more questions? All right. Well, let's take another look at what these guys look like, and we are done for the day. I hope you guys enjoyed. I love this guy so much. Please leave a comment for whatever name you think he has. If you try this at home and you make prints for yourself, whether it's this process or something else, just printmaking in general, please share that with us on our Facebook page. If you haven't joined it yet, don't forget there is that one security question that lets you in. But that was Drypoint Etching. I really hope you guys try this for yourselves. And we will see you next week, which Emmy is going to be on next week, and she's going to be showing you how to paint hair with acrylics. And she's got a really fun process this time, so definitely check that out. All right, we will see you all next time. Bye.